There we go. There's Rex coming back in. Turn to the book of First Chronicles, if you would. And if you happen to have a Bible just exactly like mine, which is probably not the case, that would be page 405. We're in First Chronicles chapter 9. We had looked last week at the background of Kings and Chronicles, how these books came into existence, who is commonly thought to have written or recorded these books, inspired by the Holy Spirit, how they appear, how they share a lot of common material, but they are not duplicates of each other. And it would appear at first, just at a casual glance, that they're unnecessarily repetitive. Why do we need two different accounts of so much of the same information? But they cross-check each other, they corroborate each other. And Chronicles, which is where we are tonight, deals almost exclusively with the southern kingdom, or the kingdom of Judah, and being written after captivity, it's written as a historical record. So it gives the restored people of Judah who've come back from Babylonian captivity, it gives them a clear-cut record of how they got where they are, who's who in their nation, and so forth. Now, we looked at the first 8 chapters or so last week. The portion that really, in the book of First Chronicles, really parallels the events of Joshua and Judges and First and Second Samuel. It's just sort of a thumbnail sketch of all that whole period of Hebrew history. Well, that brings us to chapter 9, and I think we touched on that a little bit last week in First Chronicles. This is a genealogy or a record of all of the exiles, all of the people that came back. Now, one of the things to remember, they had been in captivity. The nation of Judah had been in captivity, deported from their homeland for a total of about 70 years. Some of them less than that, because there were actually 3 deportations over a 20-year period. The first took place in 606, and that's when Daniel and the young people of the royal and noble families were taken away into captivity and pressed into service. Daniel would spend his entire adult life as a Babylonian and then Persian bureaucrat. He would spend 70 plus years basically being a government employee for the people that conquered his nation, and a prophet of God in the bargain. But he started in Babylonian service when he was just a young person, about 606 BC. About 9 years later, as things turn around and change, the Babylonians come back in 597 BC, and this is when Ezekiel, a priest, is taken away with his wife into captivity, and basically you might say the upper middle class were deported at that point. And they spend about 60 years roughly in captivity. The nation is in captivity the whole 70 years because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians have the nation of Judah under their thumb the whole time. But some of the people had remained in Judah until about 597. Well, when they're taken away, then the kingship changes in rapid succession in Judah, in Jerusalem, and now in 586, Zedekiah, the last king to rule in Jerusalem ever, the last legitimate king to ever rule from Jerusalem, rebels and just gets too big for his britches, you might say. And at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, who has done nothing over the intervening years but grow more and more and more powerful, basically says, I have had enough, and sends his troops in. The Jews, instead of taking Jeremiah's advice and surrendering, knuckling under, and going peacefully into captivity, the folks that remain fight and resist. The Babylonians have to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem and batter down the walls. So when they get finally into the city, they're good and mad. Well, they demolish the city. I mean, not one stone left on top of another hardly, and demolish the palace and the temple. And the people who remain then, they're not taken away into captivity like the nobles with Daniel 20 years before. They're not taken away into captivity like the upper middle class with Ezekiel 10 or 11 years before, where they were told, gather up your stuff and come, you're going to Babylon, and we're going to settle you there. You can buy a house, you can buy a farm, you can ply your trade. They weren't just deported. These folks in 586 who had resisted and fought against the Babylonians, these were the folks who were literally marched away in chains. Some of them to be sold on the auction block as slaves as punishment for their resistance. So these are the folks that really, really, really would suffer in this whole process. Well, that generation spends roughly 50 years, if they survive, in captivity in Babylon. But their nation, the entity, has been in captivity for 70 years. So when they come back, now we have a record of the families who came back. One of the things to remember is that Jeremiah chapter 29, Jeremiah, by inspiration, has instructed these people in their captivity. You pray for the welfare, you pray for the prosperity and the good of the city where you are. These are people that are away from their homes. They're away from Jerusalem. They're away from Judah. They're away from the promised land. And why? Because of their own sin, because of their own stiff-necked stubbornness. Well, they're going to be there a while. Buy a house, buy a farm, set up shop and conduct your business. You're going to be here a while. It's not going to be temporary. Get married, have a family, have some kids, have some grandkids. Well, what happens in the meantime? Well, grandma and grandpa get old and they die. We're not going to stack up people like cordwood and bring them back to Judah to bury them 50, 60, 70 years from now. We're going to bury them here in Babylon, here in Persia, here, wherever they're scattered. And so by the time we come down to this point, 1 Chronicles chapter 9, where the people are about to come back, or in fact, the people that are reading this have come back, most of the Jews, most of the Israelites, all 12 tribes, are never going to come back. They're going to continue to live in Babylon, continue to live in Persia, continue to live in all of the 127 provinces that the Babylonians and the Persians controlled, in what used to be the Assyrian Empire. Some of them are going to pack up and move west and eventually wind up in modern day Turkey, and from Turkey to Greece, and from Greece through southern Europe into Italy and Rome, what will become the Roman Empire. At this point, it's just a little backwater kingdom, but they will continue to migrate and immigrate all over the known world. Before captivity, before Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, most all of the Jewish Hebrew people lived within 100, 150 miles of each other. After captivity, they're going to be scattered all over the known world. So when Cyrus, the king of the Persians that took the place of the Babylonians, gives the order or the decree in 586 BC that says anybody that wants to, of the house of Israel, of the kingdom of Judah and the house of Israel, anybody that wants to can go home, go back to the promised land. Well, out of millions of Jews, millions of Hebrew people, about 50,000 actually do. Now, a big number of the others support them financially to do that. Oh, my son is calling. I'm sorry. No, I don't. He wants to talk about buying a computer, and I don't need to talk to him about that right now. He'll get over it. he's got a new computer on his brain and he wants input. I'm sorry, folks. Anyhow, Cyrus gives the order that they can go home. About 50,000 of them do. Many of the others support them financially, send money back to help contribute to rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls, the city of Jerusalem, and so forth. But after captivity, most Jewish people, most Hebrew people, number one, are not going to ever live in the promised land. Number two, most of them will live their lives never seeing it. It gets to the point quickly where a pilgrimage, a trip to Jerusalem is the high point of their life. It's literally the trip of a lifetime, and they make it their goal to try to do that once in a lifetime, once the temple is rebuilt. And keep in mind that the temple that is going to be rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah is going to be a poor man's copy of Solomon's magnificent temple. It'll be 500, 400 plus years until the temple is rebuilt or remodeled, basically in the days of Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa. In the days of Jesus, this was still going on. And that temple will be much, much larger, much, much more ornate, and it'll be finished, actually. The remodeling project takes about 65 years. It'll be finished just in time for the Romans in 70 AD to come in and demolish it right down to the ground. The only part of it that's even left is what's now called the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, there in Jerusalem. And there's a Muslim mosque built on what used to be the foundation of the temple. So this record that starts in 1 Chronicles chapter 9 is for the people that, really for all of the Jews, but particularly for the people that came back to the promised land. This is a record of who these people are. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. Now that's important that that is stated, because the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, all of these prophets that lived and taught and preached and pleaded with the people during the time leading up to the conquest and the captivity, all of these prophets were telling them, here's the problem, here's why this is going to happen. It's because of your sin. But the false prophets and the rulers and the hard-hearted were saying, well, it's not our fault, it's our ancestors that caused all this problem. It's not our fault, it's somebody else's problem. It's somebody else. It's not, God is not fair to us. So here, as they come back from captivity, one of the things that is emphasized is, this is why this happened in the first place. You did not keep faith with God. Your ancestors did not keep faith with God. Now, the first to dwell again in their possessions in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and some of the people of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. And that's important also, because the land of Israel, the territory, at its greatest point under David and Solomon, was several hundred miles in every direction. It encompassed areas all the way down to the border with Egypt and down to the Arabian Peninsula and eastward as far as almost to Persia in some respects, as far as their influence, north up into the region of the Syrians and the Assyrian Empire. And at this, hey, come on in, man. Good to see you.
I just had to come and verify. I don't want to interrupt.
This is Kings and Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
On Tuesdays?
On Tuesdays at 6:30.
Thursdays?
Can't.
I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all right.
We go back a long way.
It's good to see you, sir. Thursdays, I believe, is Greek and Psalms, and
But your Tuesday, 6:30.
Tuesday 6:30 is Kings and Chronicles for me.
And Thursday the same time?
I'm not teaching on Thursday night.
You don't teach on Thursday?
Not here.
Not here.
No, I'm in Fayetteville on Thursday night.
I just had to come to verification and completion. Right. I'm not gonna hold y'all up, but I will see you
next Tuesday night.
Next week tonight.
Okay. I'll look for you. Good to see you, man. Did you get your research paper in the mail?
Huh?
Did you get your paper from last time?
Yeah, I had some questions whenever we want to break bread. I brought them.
Okay, we'll talk about it next time.
I brought them.
Okay.
Okay.
Good deal. My apologies. That's a student from last semester. Mr. Brown, as I recall. Anyhow, the interesting thing about the genealogy here, these people that came back wind up in Jerusalem. Now, for the Jews, the people of the tribe of Judah, that's reasonable and logical because Jerusalem is in the territory of Judea. And it had been the historic capital of the nation in the days of Saul and David and Solomon. And then after the divided kingdom, it was the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom, for all those hundreds of years. But notice here, some of the people of Judah and Benjamin, all right, these are folks who live in that area. Their ancestors lived in that area, but also Ephraim, who was to the north, Manasseh, who was even farther north. And so you've got some from the northern tribes, the nation of Israel, the apostate nation. You've got some of their people now who have come back to the faith. They have come back to the proper religion and worship of God, and they've come back to the promised land. They're living in the territory of Judah, not in their own historic territories of Ephraim and Manasseh and so forth, because those areas are still under the control of people that would come to be known as Samaritans. Now, Ephraim and Manasseh were two of the 10 tribes that composed the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom, called Israel after the nation split, had been conquered 150 years before the southern kingdom by a different empire, by the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians deported all of those people, they brought in other conquered people from other areas and settled them in the territory that had belonged to Israel. Basically, they took people from over here and brought them here, took people from here and sent them over there, swapped territories with them. Well, they brought their idolatrous worship with them, and their descendants became the folks that came to be known in the first century as Samaritans. That's part of why the Jews in the first century had such a bitter hatred for the Samaritan people, because they viewed them as interlopers, people that had no business being there in the first place. Now, in their defense, the Samaritan people had adopted part of the Jews' religion. They adopted Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as scripture, and they worshiped God according to those books. But they didn't accept any of the prophets or the other inspired Old Testament books. And so there was a sharp difference between them and the Jews. Well, the record here, we begin at verse 3 to name the tribes and then the people. Uthai, the son of Ammihud, the son of Omri, the son of Imri, the son of Benai, the son of Perez, the son of Judah. Well, what this is a genealogy backwards, showing how these people were in fact legitimate descendants of their tribes, legitimate descendants of Judah. You get down to verse 10, of the priests, Yediah, Jehoiarib, Akin, Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, and so on and so forth, all the way back to whom? All the way back to the priestly lineage of the Levites. Verse 14, Shemaiah, the son of Hasab, the son of Azrikam, the son of Hashabiah, and so forth. Going back, so that they could trace their lineage. Now, as we get farther down in chapter 9, we have some of the responsibilities that were assigned to them. And that tells us that as this is being written, we're looking back. This is not being written the minute that they got back to the promised land. The order was given, you can go back 536 BC. It's going to take another 100 years, basically, or most of 100 years, for these people to get their act together. It took about 20 plus years to actually get the temple rebuilt. They started, they laid the foundation, they ran into trouble, they ran into opposition, and what did they do? You look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, what happened? Well, they ran into opposition, and so they stopped. They stopped building the temple, and they concentrated on their own houses and their own businesses and so forth. And they did not prosper. So along comes Ezra, and so let's get this straightened out. After him, Nehemiah, let's get this straightened out. Let's get going again. Finally, after 20 odd years, they get the temple finished. So we've gone from 536 down to about 515 BC, 20 some odd, 21 years to get that done. It's going to take more years still to get the walls of the city of Jerusalem built. They're not going to finish all of this until ultimately they get several more years down the road. It's going to be at one point nearly 100 years before they get some of these details wound up. When exactly are these books of Chronicles being written? Well, they're not being written in 536. At this point, we read in verse 17 about the gatekeepers, Shallum, Akab, Talmon, Ahiman, and their kinsmen. Shallum was the chief. Well, gatekeepers of what? That would be gatekeepers of the temple. So what we're doing here, what we've got going on here is these people, these books are being written probably around the year 500, 510 BC. At some point after the temple has already been rebuilt, been finished. It may even be down into the early 400s, 490, 480. Maybe as much as 50 years after the time that the Hebrew people are allowed to go back from captivity. So at this point, you have a record. You have a group of people, you have the beginnings of a rebuilt nation. You have several thousands, tens of thousands of people, maybe 50 or 100,000 people living there at this point in time in the environment of Jerusalem. Now, keep in mind, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, when they first come back and they reestablish the nation, the nation is, as nations go, it's a joke. Over in Europe, there are a couple of little nations down on the southern coast of Europe on the Mediterranean. You've got Monaco, and then I forget what the other little duchy down there is, but then you go up by the Dutch border and you've got this little country called Liechtenstein, and then you've got Belgium, which is a full-blown nation, and NATO has got its headquarters there and so forth, but it's about that big. Those places, except maybe for Monaco, would make Judah look puny by comparison. At the time that this is being written, the land area for the whole nation of Judah is maybe a couple of 100 square miles, 10 miles across, 20 miles long, maybe, all centered around Jerusalem. It's not a lot of territory. Now, it will eventually get bigger as time goes by and more people inhabit it and so forth. But in the meantime, this record really charts the progress that they've made. You've got a generation or maybe two generations at this point that have grown up in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. You've got folks that have never lived in captivity. Their grandparents did, or maybe their parents did. Maybe their parents were born in captivity, but they were of those who came back. And so you've got some folks that have never lived in captivity. So here you have a record that traces not only backwards to their historic roots, to the sons of Jacob, but you also have a record that traces since their return to the promised land, and the roles that some of them occupy, the gatekeepers, the Korahites in charge of the work of service, keepers of the threshold of the tent as their ancestors were, enrolled by genealogies in their villages, verse 22. David and Samuel the seer, the prophet, established them in their office of trust, so they and their sons were in charge of the gates of the house of the Lord, the gate, that is the house of the tent, as guards and so forth. So we're talking about historic precedent for these people. Go down to verse 28. Some of them had charge of the utensils of service, for they were required to count them when they were brought in and taken out. Others were appointed over the furniture and the holy utensils, the fine flour, the wine, the oil, the incense, the spices. Others of the sons of the priest prepared the mixing of the spices, and Mattathiah, one of the Levites, the firstborn of Shallum the Korahite, was entrusted with making the flat cakes. That's the showbread for the table of showbread in the temple. And some of the kinsmen of the Korahites had charge of the showbread to prepare it every Saturday. And then you had the singers and so forth. But then we get down here in chapter 9 to verse 35. And just kind of seemingly out in the middle of nowhere, here's the lineage of King Saul. In Gibeon lived the father of Gibeon, Jael, and the name of his wife was Maacah. His firstborn was Abdon, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Ner, Nadab, Geder, Ahio, Zechariah, and Mikloth. Mikloth was the father of Shemayim, and so on and so forth. And we get down here to Saul. And we have the family of Saul. And that brings us to chapter 10 and the death of Saul and his sons. There's no extensive record of Saul. Saul reigned for 40 years, and he was famous or infamous, depending on your perspective and where in his reign you lived. But he's just recorded here as a fact, and then we're going to move on to David in chapter 11. Well, notice chapter 10 is primarily focused on the death of Saul. It looks back to the beginning of the era of the kings of Israel. And so we go down through here. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was wounded. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me." But he would not do it. He feared the Lord. And therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon him. Well, the next day, the Philistines find his body, they mutilate it, and then we have the record of the men of Jabesh Gilead, whom Saul early in his reign had rescued from oppression. They come and they claim the body, everything but Saul's head that had been taken away. They claim the body and bring it and bury it. And they have 7 days of fasting and mourning. But notice there are a couple of important things here in chapter 10. In verse 10, they put Saul's armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. But then you get down here to verse 13. So Saul died. Why? Because of his unfaithfulness. Saul's defeat by the Philistines was not because the Philistines were great or because God was on their side or anything. It was because Saul broke faith with God. He did not seek guidance from the Lord, verse 14 says. He died for the transgressions that he committed against the Lord. So then you pick up at chapter 11, and we're introduced to David. All Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, we're your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. So you have a historical record here. Think of the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles as being written to be post-exile histories, post-exile Judah's history textbook. Now, in that, you have cross-references in 1st and 2nd Kings, and we'll get back to that when we come to 2nd Chronicles. Everything that we're reading about here, though, predates all of that in 1st Chronicles. So this is Israel's or Judah's history book. Now, chapters 11 and 12 show us David becoming king. He becomes king first in Hebron, down in the south, and then ultimately in Jerusalem, picking up at verse 4, after Saul's son's son quits trying to oppose him, and he becomes king over the whole nation. And then we have lists of his advisors and his mighty men, as they're called. One commentator refers to some of those mighty men as his Philistine mercenaries, which that might be true in some respects because some of them were not Israelites. They were men who had been with him from the time that he was among the Philistines at Ziklag and so forth. You had others like Uriah the Hittite, who were not native Jews, not native Israelites, but they had cast their lot with Israel under David's leadership, and we would presume became proselyte Jews, but they're still known to history by their ethnic origins. This one's a Hittite, that one's a Philistine, and so forth. This is a Moabite. Of course, David has Moabite ancestry in his grandmother, and farther back he has Canaanite ancestry in his great-great-grandmother, because his great-great-grandmother is Rahab and his grandmother is Ruth. And so they're from outside of Israel. But that part is not emphasized here in Chronicles because the focus here is on Judah, on the nation of Judah, and particularly the tribe of Judah. So at verse 4 in chapter 11, you have David's conquest of Jerusalem. This is an area that had been given to Judah in the days, the tribe of Judah in the days of Joshua, but not all the Jebusites, the people of Jerusalem, had been driven out, had been conquered. That had been kind of a stronghold. When you take a map and look at the territory, you can see why. Jerusalem sits at the confluence of two valleys, so the only practical approach is from the north. Otherwise, you have to cross down into this valley and climb up, or cross down into this valley and climb up. The only way to approach the city is from the north, basically, or from the northwest. And it's rough terrain. It's on top of a mountain, basically, on top of the hills of Judea. And so, for whatever reason, the tribe of Judah had not completely conquered it. You have Jebusites there in the days of David. And David goes in and takes the city, conquers it, lives there, and it becomes called the city of David. Well, At verse 6, whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first. So he became David's general. Well, that's all well and good, except when we get down to Solomon, we're going to see that Joab has overplayed his hand. Joab is a man with ambition. He wants to be in charge as much as he possibly can. And that's going to get him into trouble because, among other things, it'll be Joab who executes Absalom, directly violating David's specified order to deal gently with him, to deal kindly with him. Well, the rest of this then is David built the city, built the walls, repaired the city. Joab supervised the repairs. David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. And now you have the record of David's mighty men. That is the chiefs, the advisors and counselors, and the men that fought with him that were notable here in chapter 11. On account of David's mighty men, Yashabim, a Hachmonite, chief of the three, wielded his spear against 300 whom he killed at one time. Next to him among the three was Eleazar of Dodo, the Ahohite, and he was with David at Pas Dammim when the Philistines were gathered there for battle. Took his stand in the midst of the plot and defended it, killed the Philistines. The Lord saved them by a very great victory. 3 of the 30 chief men went down to David at the cave of Adullam when the Philistines were camped in the valley of Rephaim and so forth. So you have this record of all of these mighty men. What this does is it gives this generation, or these generations of Jews and Israelites, all Jews are Israelites, not all Israelites were Jews in terms of their tribe, as that word, we talked about this last week, as that word comes to be used from the time of exile onward down to the first century, Jew and Israelite are basically interchangeable because it refers to religion more than to tribal identity. Before captivity, Jew primarily referred to the tribe of Judah. After captivity, it's basically interchangeable with all of the 12 tribes, all Israelites. So here you have a record going back to these people. And in chapter 12, you have this long record of all these names. Time won't permit us to go into all the details of them. There's a lot here that you can cross-check and cross-reference. At chapter 12, these are the men who came to David at Ziklag when he could not move about freely because of Saul. And they were bowmen and slingers and powerful men, strong men of all sorts. Come down to chapter 12 and verse 18. And Amasai, chief of the 30, pledges their loyalty to David. Now this, at the time that this takes place, their casting their lot with David was tantamount to putting a price on their heads. They were signing their own death warrant in a sense, because Saul was still king, and he was actively hunting for them. But Amasai, the chief of the 30, says, "We are yours, O David, with you, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, peace to your helpers, for your God helps you." Then David received them and made them officers of his troops. And what you see here as we go through here, some of the men of Manasseh deserted to David when he came with the Philistines. And then as we go along, those of other tribes gathering to David. And we see even down here at chapter 12 and verse 29 of the Benjaminites, the kinsmen of Saul. Now, Saul is still the king at this point. 3,000 of them, of whom the majority had to that point kept their allegiance to the house of Saul. Ephraimites, 20,800. What you see is the tide turning in favor of the house of David. You see that God had anointed him, God had chosen him, and now all of these are casting their lot with David. And what this is a record of how the rulership and the authority and the acceptance by the people had moved from Saul to David. Now, why does that matter to this post-exile generation of people?
Because they are from the tribe of Judah primarily.
Prophecy.
The majority of people that are there rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the nation, are of the tribe of Judah. By the time that Nebuchadnezzar completed the conquest in 586, now Nebuchadnezzar had been an Assyrian general, or Nabopolassar, his father, had been an Assyrian general, and Nebuchadnezzar then basically rebelled against the Assyrians and conquered them. The Assyrians had conquered the other 10 tribes 150 years earlier. So they're already scattered all over the countryside, so to speak, by the time Nebuchadnezzar comes along. They've already been in captivity 140, 150 years. Nebuchadnezzar comes along, the Babylonian Empire just shoots to prominence, and the Assyrians are vanquished, never to be heard from again as a nation, as an empire. And Nebuchadnezzar conquers Judah. They go into their 70 years of captivity because of their faithlessness and idolatry. And at the end of 70 years, just as Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah and others had promised, they're allowed to go home if they want to. Most of them don't, but some of them do. And not just the tribe of Judah, but any of the 12 tribes. And the fact that you've got people from Manasseh and from Ephraim and some of these other tribes shows that some of them did. But at this point, those 10 northern tribes, they've been removed from their ancestral homeland for 200 years, 200 and more. So they're not 2 or 3 generations removed. They're 8 or 9 generations removed in some cases from ever having lived in the promised land. So given that they were steeped in idolatry when they were taken into captivity, hadn't been worshiping, for the most part, had not been worshiping the God of Israel for generations, ever since Jeroboam, for hundreds of years. And they've been in captivity in paganism and idolatry for a couple hundred more years. When Cyrus says you can go home, for a whole lot of those folks in those tribes, they've been home for centuries. They don't have any strong collective memory of the promised land compared to the tribe of Judah. So most of these people that go back are of the tribe of Judah. And the focus is on the tribe of Judah because the tribe of Judah, the nation of Judah, is the group in the 12 tribes that at least nominally had remained faithful to God all this time. Now, they had not been. In some ways, they'd actually been worse before captivity. But God had promised to restore them. So the focus is on connecting these post-exile generations to that history and making sure that they know that history and understand they're connected to that greatness. And so we have the record about David, Saul and David, and then we'll get to Solomon here in a little bit. Well, chapter 13 of First Chronicles tells of bringing the Ark of the Covenant that had been captured by the Philistines and then turned loose 7 months later, because it, as the saying goes, it brought them bad luck. It was God demonstrating his superiority over their false god. Now we have David bringing the ark from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. There's an interesting thing here. David does not bring the Ark of the Covenant back to the tabernacle, which had been at Shiloh. He brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, where his capital is. Well, we know that David intends to build a temple, or he wants to. He's not allowed to. We'll get to that in a moment. But in chapter 13, we have the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant, a record of the death of Uzzah. When David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, that's the point at which he also set aside or made appointments of courses of priests and musicians to play their instruments in connection with giving thanks. You look over to chapter 16 and you have a reference, a more detailed reference to this. Chapter 16, verses 4, 5, and 6, the instruction: give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people, sing to him, sing praises, tell of his wondrous works, glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who ask the Lord rejoice, or who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord in his strength, seek his presence continually. Remember the wondrous works he's done, his miracles, judgments he uttered. O offspring of Israel, his servant, sons of Jacob, his chosen ones, and so on and so forth. This goes all the way down to almost the end of the chapter. But back here in chapter 13, we have the record of bringing the Ark of the Covenant back, or to Jerusalem, really for the first time, not back to Jerusalem, but to Jerusalem. And you have the record of Uzzah and his having touched the Ark of the Covenant when he should not. Well, what's the explanation of the problem here? Why does this incident happen? Well, the answer is stated in so many words over in chapter 15. David talking about this with Zadok and Abiathar and the rest of the priests. After this incident, they set this aside in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. Nothing bad happened. Obed-Edom prospered. Well, let's figure out what we did wrong. What did they do wrong? Well, they had tried to move the Ark of the Covenant the same way the Philistines had done. The Philistines, well, they're not children of God at that point. They're idol worshipers. They just wanted it gone. They loaded it on an ox cart and sent it away. God had given specific instructions for how the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Levites specifically, were supposed to handle the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Uzzah was a Levite, but they weren't doing this right. So you get down here to chapter 15 and verse 13, and he says, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the due order, according to the rule. In other words, David says, we're the ones that messed up. Well, that's correct. They didn't do things the way God had prescribed. And in the 21st century, in the religious environment of our time, we look at that and say, that's a pretty minor thing. But details matter. Details always matter with God. When God gives a specific instruction, that matters. And we have to follow that specific instruction. If you look across the spectrum, the range of Christendom as it exists in the 21st century, all the different religious bodies and groups and denominations that would describe themselves as Christian, what do you see? Well, you've got Catholicism on this end, and you've got charismatic and Pentecostalism over here, and you've got the Mormons and their peculiarities over here, and the Jehovah's Witnesses over here, and the Protestants kind of interspersed amongst all of those. You've got a wide range of conflicting and contradictory beliefs, don't you? Well, how so? This one says, well, I think it ought to be this way. And that one says, well, I think it ought to be that way. And you've got three over here that say, we got together and voted on it, and it should be thus and such and so and so. And so now you've got literally thousands of denominations and conflicting and contradictory religious groups all claiming to be the church that Jesus built. But God is not the author of confusion. How did that situation come about? People didn't pay attention. People don't pay attention to the details God has given. What did Jesus say? I will build my what? My church. Number one, it's not our church, it's his church. Number two, he only promised to build one. And you get over to Ephesians chapter 4, and you look at what Brother Norman Starling used to describe as the planks in God's platform for unity whenever there was an election coming around. And what do you read? There is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. 7 ones in verses 4, 5, and 6. And among those 7 ones, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. What else is there? There's one church. Back up to Colossians chapter 1. What do we learn between verses 13 and 18 in Colossians chapter 1? That one church is the body of Christ. How many bodies does Christ have? Got one. He's the head over the body. And we look at this environment we live in. If we're trying to be anything besides that one church that we can read about in the scriptures, if we're doing anything in the way of ignoring the details that God has given us in the scriptures about it, well, then we wind up being exactly what these folks were in David's day. We're not seeking him according to his instructions. And we live in a time when people say, well, why should that matter? Well, the simple explanation is it matters because he's God and I'm not. He's God and we're not. We don't get to make up the rules, as it were. He does. Well, as we continue through here, chapter 13 talks about bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant remained in the house of Obed-Edom 3 months, and the Lord blessed the house, and ultimately we get it to Jerusalem. Chapter 14, you have the record of David's family, his wives and his children. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, cedar trees, masons, carpenters to build a house for him. David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. His kingdom was highly exalted for the sake of his people Israel. Took more wives in Jerusalem, fathered more sons and daughters. Now, that's not complimentary to David. That's a simple statement of fact. David had a house full of wives. David was evidently very focused on creating a dynasty, creating a lineage, having plenty of sons. If something happens to this one, to borrow from Bill Cosby, I'll take you out and make another one looks just like you. Well, he had plenty of them. The names of the children born in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpelet, Noga, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Beeliada, and Eliphalet, 2 Eliphilets in there. How did he keep them all straight? I don't know. My grandmother was the oldest daughter of 21 children. I don't know how my great-grandfather kept them all straight, but apparently he managed. Well, we have a record then, just a thumbnail sketch of David's ongoing conflict with the Philistines. Now, remember, when Saul was still king, David had friends among the Philistines. The king sorry, I just drew a mental blank. One of the 5 major Philistine cities was a friend of David and trusted David, gave him Ziklag and its surrounding villages as his own territory to live in and be safe in. And David had to live there for a period of years while Saul was hunting for him and gunning to kill him, basically. Well, after David becomes king, all this good relations with some of the Philistines basically is off. And this is a thumbnail sketch, not of one battle, but of a whole series of conflicts between Israel and the Philistines. And of course, David, with God's help, ultimately subjugates the Philistines. They become a tribute nation to Israel in David's day, and they'll remain a tributary nation in Solomon's day. But once the kingdom is divided, the Philistines will gain strength and become a problem once again. Chapter 15 brings us to the coming of the ark to Jerusalem proper. And this is where David appoints the musicians and sets things up. And we have a record here of the sons of the Levites and their responsibilities, how many of them there were. And at verse 16, David commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, harps, lyres, cymbals, and so on and so forth. Now, it's worth pointing out something here, just in passing, that the mention of all of this in the worship in Jerusalem is sometimes brought out as saying, well, then it's okay for us to do this in the church. Well, that's fine, except if this is going to be our authority, then who is it that's supposed to do this? It's the Levites, not all of Israel, and certainly not all of Christians. It would have to be Levites. And it would have to be in Jerusalem or at Gibeon. And it would have to be in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And it would have to be accompanied by burnt offerings. So if this authorizes one thing mentioned here for Christians in the church in the 21st century to do this, it authorizes all of these things. In fact, it doesn't just authorize, it would require all of these things. There's no passage in Scripture where God ever says, here's this, and this. You get to pick and choose what you do. Always with God, when he prescribes something, it's an all or nothing deal. And so if we're going to try to claim this and say, well, that allows us to do this in church today, we have to bring everything, not just bits and parts. And practically speaking, what proves too much proves nothing. Well, they bring the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant from the house of Obed-Edom, and they rejoice and they celebrate. Come to the end of chapter 15, as the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window, saw King David dancing and rejoicing, and despised him in her heart. Well, that's just a simple record, statement of fact. It doesn't give us the whole story, as Samuel does, second Samuel, how that from this day on, David she lived basically like a widow, and he didn't have her in his harem, and she died childless. But that's the backstory of this. So at chapter 16, we'll look at 16 and 17 and then take our break here in just a moment. At chapter 16, now you have the Ark of the Covenant brought into Jerusalem, and they put it in a tent. Now, it's not clear if this is a tent that David has had made for it, or if this is the actual tent of the tabernacle that they have brought. If it's the actual tabernacle brought from Shiloh, there's no passage that states that in so many words. But they pitch a tent for it. They offer burnt offerings, peace offerings. They begin to restore proper worship. Keep in mind, during the time that the Ark of the Covenant was in Philistine possession, 7 months, and 3 more months in the house of Obed-Edom, you got most of a year there. There's a big part of their worship that's impacted by its absence. They can't carry on their normal worship in the tabernacle because in their minds, the thing that represents the presence of God isn't there. Now, having said that, keep in mind that for these folks, the Ark of the Covenant, in some ways, it was almost, at times they treated it almost like an idol, because the mercy seat in their minds, that was God's presence. But here, things are starting to get back to where they ought to be. So, come then.
Wasn't the ark in the Philistines' hands exactly because of them treating the ark like an idol?
Yes.
Up to the battle? I don't remember the details of that.
That's a point well taken. The ark had been in Philistine custody, you might say, specifically because they had used it like it was some kind of a lucky charm. They had sent, Saul had sent for it. They'd taken it out to battle, and it had been captured. They took it out as if it would somehow bring them luck, bring them success. Because you think about it, that's what the pagan people did. They brought idols of their deities into battle with them. Well, the Jews then act like this is an idol, and it backfires on them. Well, at 1 Chronicles chapter 17 now, you have the record of the Lord renewing his covenant with David. And here, David wants to build a temple. I dwell in a fine cedar house, and the ark of the Lord is in a tent, and I want to build a temple for the Lord here in Jerusalem. And Nathan the prophet, who is David's confidant at this point, Nathan's initial reaction is, hey, great, sounds like a good idea to me. And God then has to send Nathan back with a different message. And the message is, when did I ever ask you to build me a temple? There's an important lesson there. God never said, don't build a temple. There was, at this point, there was no prohibition. There was no example of God saying, thou shalt not build a temple. But when David says, hey, I want to build a temple, and God's man, Nathan, says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Then God says, Nathan, you got to go back and undo this. I didn't authorize this. I didn't tell you, I didn't say to do this. Well, what's the lesson? Where God has not spoken, that doesn't give us permission. We act sometimes, and this is the genesis, this is the beginning of a whole lot of what goes on in the religious community today. We act as if, well, God didn't say not to, so we can do A, B, C, or X, Y, Z. But that's not the pattern that you see in the scriptures. The pattern that you see in the scriptures is that God's people always do what they do and teach what they teach because God authorized them to. He gave permission, he gave instruction, he gave a requirement. And where he didn't speak, we don't have any authority.
I have a question. I was thinking about your statement that Christ would build his church.
Mm-hmm.
How specific the instructions were for the tabernacle in Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And they were followed to the letter.
Very detailed. Again and again. So they did according to all that Moses was shown.
And so could the church be a parallel to the antitype of the tabernacle, in that we have to do everything exactly as Christ set it up, just as they did do for the tabernacle?
Look at the application that the Hebrews writer makes in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5. He goes back to that very thing and writing to Jewish Christians about the church. What's the point that he makes? Just like God told Moses, see that you make all things according to the pattern that I showed you on the mountain. Well, the application is, Christian, you do everything just like God told you to. And that would pertain to the church and our own personal lives as well. So that comparison is an apt one. That comparison is an accurate one in that respect. Here in chapter 17, David says, I want to build a temple. Hey, great. Oops, no, you can't do that. God didn't tell you to. But what does God do in connection with this? He doesn't just cut him off at the knees and say, no, you can't do that. He also makes him a promise, a whole series of promises, really. Number one, your son will get to build the temple. Number two, I will establish your household, your lineage forever. And he does. Now, how would David understand the idea of forever? Well, David's living in Jerusalem. David's got a house full of sons and daughters, and he's looking forward to the day that one of his sons will be the king after him, and his grandson will be the king after that, and his great-grandson will be the king after that. It would be entirely understandable for David to be thinking in purely physical, material, national terms. Makes perfect sense. The fact that David would think that way doesn't take away from the fact that God is looking far beyond that and far over that. To whom? To Jesus, the Son of David, who would reign, is reigning forever over his kingdom, but will never reign on a throne in Jerusalem, because he's already reigning at the right hand of God. And he can't reign on a throne in Jerusalem because he's a descendant of David through Jeconiah. And Jeconiah was the king that was cut off at the knees, so to speak, by the Babylonians. And Jeremiah says no descendant of his will ever prosper reigning in Jerusalem. Well, that brings us to a quarter till, and we'll need to kind of pick up and fly through the balance of this, but we'll take about a 15-minute break here. So we'll reconvene at 8 o'clock. Okay, so we talked about David wanting to build the temple and how that God did not permit that. So we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 18 now. And from this point on, what we have is a record of David defeating his enemies, various ones that he confronted. And then we'll move on to the reign of Solomon, his son. So God has promised David, I'll establish your lineage, I'll establish your household forever. You come to the end of chapter 17. David has responded to this. Lord, you are God. You have promised this good thing to your servant, and so on and so forth. So after this, David defeated the Philistines, subdued them, took Gath and its villages out of the hand of the Philistines, defeated Moab, and the Moabites became servants, and defeated Hadad-Ezer. And you have just a record of conquest after conquest after conquest here in chapter 18. Now, as we go forward, you have also little details of David's government and his administration. You look at the end of chapter 18, David reigned over all Israel, administered justice and equity to all his people. Now, there's a purpose to that statement, because number one, that's a contrast to the way that Saul had ruled. Saul started out good and ended up corrupt. Saul had started out humble and ended up trying to manipulate the people against David, particularly, but always in his favor. Here, David administers justice and equity, but there's also an implication here. Look at the next verses. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder.
What verse are we in?
We're in chapter 18 at verse 14 and 15. And then in verse 16, Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. Shavsha was secretary. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were the chief officials in service of the king. So on the one hand, you've got Joab, who is the major general. He's the chief of staff of the army, so to speak. He is one of David's major advisors. He's in a position of responsibility, a position of power. As we go forward, one of the things we're going to see is that just because David was just and equitable, not everybody under him was. And Joab is going to be near the head of that list. Some of his sons, likewise, are going to be near the head of that list. Now, in chapter 19, you have the incident where the Ammonites they humiliate some of David's servants. The background of this is that the king of the Ammonites, Nahash, has died, and his son takes the throne. Nahash and David had a good relationship. David tried to maintain good relationships with his neighbors as much as he could. Now, with the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, these are historic enemies of his people. The Ammonites were, but they're a little farther away, like the people like Hiram and Tyre. They're far enough away that they're not immediate threats, and David can afford to have good relationships with people like that. And so he's had a good relationship with Nahash. Nahash dies. He has no reason to think that he's not going to continue to have a good relationship with the son, but politics interferes. He sends messengers. He basically sends a consolation message and gift and so forth. And the advisors say, well, you know what he's doing. He's really just sent these people to spy on us so he can come wage war on us and conquer us. So they take David's servants and they humiliate them. They shaved them and they cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. In other words, they humiliated them publicly. And so these men are hugely ashamed. They're encountered now at Jericho. David was told what happened to them. He sends others to meet them. And notice where he leaves them, where he tells them to stay. You get down here to verse 5, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. Now, for a Jewish man to have his beard cut off was normally a sign of mourning, sign of grief. In this case, it was a sign that they had been humiliated, and this was a gesture intended to humiliate David because these guys represent him. But the instruction that he gives to them, this wasn't their fault. He's not going to take it out on them. You stay here at Jericho. Well, what's special about Jericho? Exactly. You go back about 500 or so years to the days of Joshua and the conquest. Jericho is the first place in Israel that Israel had conquered, the first place in the promised land. And God had brought the walls of Jericho down miraculously. And the city had been devoted to God. It had been obliterated by the Jews. Of course, Achan, there in Joshua chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, Achan caused his problem by disobeying. But the city was placed under a curse or under a prohibition. They were not to rebuild this city. It was devoted to God. It was first fruits of their conquest. They stay here in basically a deserted place so that they can, I'm sorry, somebody's trying to call me again and it interferes with my screen. They stay here in a deserted place until their beards grow back, so they're not out in public in a humiliated setting. This was, in a way, this was a gesture of kindness on David's part. Stay here where you're isolated and then come back. Well, the Ammonites, in the meantime, figure out this was not smart. This was not a good thing for us to do. David outnumbers us. And so they sent a bribe, 1,000 talents of silver, to hire chariots and horsemen from Mesopotamia. They go hire some mercenaries. They're not going to apologize. They're going to hire mercenaries and basically try to strike first. They're going to start a war rather than admit that they had behaved badly. Well, Joab is sent out. David sends Joab and the army out, and we have the defeat of the Ammonites and the Syrians because of the foolish advice of the young king's advisors. That's really what this comes down to. Now, in chapter 20, you have more of David's exploits, the capture of Rabbah, and Joab took the lead in that and overthrew it. David took the crown of their king from his head, weighed a talent of gold, and had precious stones, and put it in the spoils of the city and so forth. And basically, he demolishes all the cities of the Ammonites. This is in payback for what they have done. Picking up in chapter 20 now, at verse 4, after this, war with the Philistines again at Gezer, one of the 5 major cities. And among those fighting for the Philistines are relations of Goliath. Look down to verse 5. There was war with the Philistines. Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. War again at Gath. A man of great stature had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He also was descended from the giants, and so forth. Now that's a curiosity there. 6 fingers, 6 toes. If you studied biology, and particularly genes in human genome, that's actually a dominant gene. You take someone that's got 5 fingers, 5 toes on each hand, and they marry somebody that has 6, has basically an extra pinky finger. If they have children, chances are high the children will take after the 6-fingered child, parent. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII of England back in the 1500s, started a fashion among the English nobles at the time of the sleeves of her gowns being cut at an angle across her hands because she had extra fingers. She had 6 fingers and 6 toes. It's a dominant gene, but it's become so rare that for all practical purposes, it's recessive. It actually happens still, but it's not common anymore. These men, though, it was common within their lineage. And these were men related to Goliath, whom David had slain years before as just a young man. So we come then down here to the end of chapter 20. Here are these Philistines being subdued by the Israelites, by the mighty men and so forth. And chapter 21 then brings us to another foolish act on David's part. Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Now, if you go back and you look at the end of 2 Samuel, it's not explained in such detail how this came about. It's just that David did it, and we're sort of left to wonder why. Well, here we have basically an inspired commentary on 2 Samuel that explains how that came about. Satan had a hand in it. David took a census basically to figure out exactly how many soldiers he could field if he needed to. And in all, you get down here to verse 5, the number in all Israel was 1.1 million men, 1,100,000 men. And in Judah, 470,000. So you've got you've got a potential army, not a standing army, but a potential army of 1.5 million men. Now, scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries looked at numbers like this and sometimes mocked and said, well, you know, they couldn't possibly have been that big. They couldn't possibly have had that many people. You look at them today, they're just, that whole area is just a little backwater country. The territory couldn't support that many people, and so on and so forth, which shows the ignorance of the critics, not the ignorance of the Holy Spirit. In this same time period, you have Egyptian and Persian astronomers charting stars and charting the motion of the planets that they could see in our galaxy, measuring the length of the day and the length of the year down to a matter of minutes. You have the development of geometry and algebra during this period. These people were not, they were not cavemen. They were not backward. So there's no reason to believe that these numbers are anything but accurate. Now you think about the size of this potential army. In the 21st century, communist China can field 1 million men basically on a moment's notice. They have a huge standing army. In the 9th century BC, King David could potentially call out an army bigger than that. So it's a huge number. Now, for what it's worth, how did the Israelites, how did Judah determine who was a soldier and who wasn't? Well, you take out all of the Levites. The tribe of Levi were exempt from military service because they're the tribe of the priests. So you take them out, don't even count them. But who did they count? Basically, every man from age 20 to age 50. So that tells us something about the overall size of the nation. If you've got 1.5 million fighting age men, plus those who are older, plus those who are not yet old enough, if you just figure 1 woman for every man, you have a population that's got to be 4 million minimum, and probably much, much more than that, because you're not counting all the children. So we're talking about a lot of people under David's rulership. David counts all of these people. Why would he do that? Well, Satan tempted him to, prompted him to. He did not include Levi, did not include Benjamin. Joab did the actual counting. Joab was of Benjamin. And you get to verse 7, God was displeased and struck Israel. One man's bullheaded decision, David's, produces plague. It produces a problem. Look at the choice that God gives him in response to this. And think about this. David, as king, is the embodiment of the nation. He represents the whole nation. So when he does something that affects the whole nation suffers because of what he did. So you look down here at verse 10, Gad, the prophet, is sent to David. Here are the 3 things that God says you get to choose among. You can choose one of them. You can have 3 years of famine, or you can have 3 months of devastation by your foes. In other words, you can lose on the battlefield for 3 months, or you can have 3 days of the sword of the Lord, 3 days of pestilence, and the angel of the Lord destroying all through the territory. And David, needless to say, David is upset and distressed, I made a boo-boo, that doesn't even begin to touch it. So let the Lord choose. Let the Lord choose. So the Lord sends pestilence, and look at what David's bullheadedness cost him. 70,000 men of Israel fell. President Biden's poll numbers are not real good right now. I think David's poll numbers were probably really low at this point. Good thing for him, he was a king and not a president. God stops the pestilence at the threshing floor of Ornan. And it's here at the end of 2 Samuel 24 that we find David offering sacrifice. Ornan, Araunah, as he's called in 2 Samuel. David builds the altar. He buys the threshing floor and the oxen and the wood and so forth, and offers the sacrifice. Even though it was freely offered to him, he says, no, I will not take it free. I will not offer something that costs me nothing. And so the plague is stayed and God is placated at this point. So go ahead.
Mask it. Okay.
Oh,
One thing strikes me. I remember when the Israelites left Egypt, they had 600,000 fighting men.
yes.
And using your same logic of estimating the potential population,
Yep.
It's now just about what it was when they left Egypt, it sounds like. Now, that was all 12 tribes.
Right. This is all 12 tribes. Now, having said that, they had 600,550, I believe, at that point, that they go into the promised land. If we estimate one wife, one child, plus those that are older, those that are younger, we're still, and that's being extremely conservative in my judgment. At that point, we're at several million. The point being, Israel coming out of Egypt was not just a few hundred or a few thousand people wandering around in the wilderness. This was a massive number of people that God sustained in the wilderness for 40 years.
Precise.
With livestock and so forth. At this point, David's got 1.5, almost 1.6 million men. Even if there's just one woman, one child, we're still in the millions of people, and more likely, just look at the average size of a family in those days. If they had half a dozen children, they would have been a relatively small family.
Correct.
Multiply that out, you could probably be safe, and I'm just estimating, you might say spitballing here, you could probably be safe in estimating 10 more people per soldier in the nation. So we're not talking about a nation of 3 or 4 million, we'd be talking about a nation of 15 to 20 million.
Yes.
At this point.
I think maybe, I wonder if the reason that David was tempted was he was viewing himself and his nation in rather a grandiose, from a grandiose perspective, and being thinking of relying on his strength rather than on God's strength.
Well, certainly so. He had those moments, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, if he lost 70,000 men, that's 14%
Yep.
of his men.
Yep. That's a huge number.
Yes.
Like I said, his poll numbers probably weren't too good the next week.
I bet there were a lot of mad mamas.
Well, and angry wives and fatherless children too.
Yeah.
Think about it. This is probably the worst loss of life by volume in Israel since the days of the wilderness wandering. In the days of the wilderness wandering, you have all of Israel coming out of Egypt, out of slavery, 600,000 plus of military age, which is a huge army in its own right. But if you multiply that out, let's call it 5 to 6 million people. They go from Egypt to Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, where they send the 12 spies in, and God is telling them, you go possess the land. And Joshua and Caleb are saying, we can do it. And what do the people say? Well, the 10 faithless spies say, we can't do it. And the people say, we can't do it. And God says, all right, then you'll die in the wilderness. Oh, we can do it now. No, they can't, because God's not with them. What are the next 38 years? The next 38 years of
Killing off the people that didn't believe.
the next 38 years of Hebrew history are basically a 38-year funeral procession through the wilderness. How many people per day have to die to get rid of that whole generation? It's over 1,000 people a day for 38 years, most of 40 years. It's a 40-year funeral procession. Well, now you have in one day, well, over 3 days, really, 70,000 men. This is the most catastrophic loss of life that the nation has ever seen, next to that time in the wilderness, and that was spread out over 40 years.
How long was this spread out?
This was 3 days.
3 days, 7,000.
3 days of pestilence, 70,000 people. During World War II, at the end of World War II, when the United States dropped the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki, I forget which one was where, but the immediate loss of life, I believe at Hiroshima, the just in an instant loss of life was estimated at 50,000, with another 50,000 that died within a matter of hours or days after that first atomic blast. And then it was something like 70,000 at Nagasaki, or maybe I've got the numbers reversed. I don't remember which one goes with which city. And the world was relieved and horrified at what happened. And there's been nothing like that since.
In this case, since David only numbered the fighting men,
Mhm.
70,000, it was just fighting men that died, right? There were no children or wives or mothers.
70,000 men of Israel, so presumably of the fighting men.
Okay,
That's who he had counted. So presumably that's who this is. If it includes anybody else, it doesn't say so. It does say men, so I think we can safely exclude wives and children. David has a history as we look through the 40 years of his reign. He's really good. He walks with God. He's really close with God. He's very faithful. And then his ego gets away from him, or his desire gets away from him. David very, very, very much has clay feet, in a sense. And just look at all the women in his life and all the heartache that caused. What separates David from Saul and from Solomon as well was his willingness to acknowledge his sins and his shortcomings and repent again and again and again. You know, it's interesting. Peter would ask the Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Even 7 times? Now, in asking that question and giving that number, Peter was actually seemingly going way above and beyond what was commonly accepted among the Jews. The conventional wisdom seems to have been 3 strikes and you're out. You know, you sin against me and I forgive you. You sin against me and I forgive you. The 3rd time, nope, you're done. By asking even 7 times, 7 represented the idea of completeness or perfection for the Israelites. So he's saying, if I go above and beyond with 7 times, and how does Jesus answer? 70 times 7. Well, I really don't believe Jesus is saying, okay, you keep careful count, keep a record, 490 times 491, you're out of here. He's making a point. As long as that individual keeps repenting, you keep forgiving. Well, you look at David. And as long as David keeps repenting, what does God keep doing? He keeps forgiving. Well, God is placated. God is satisfied by the sacrifice at the threshing floor of Ornan, or Araunah, as Samuel calls him. And then chapter 22, now here shall be the house of the Lord. Well, he's not allowed to build it, but he is allowed to prepare for it. So he gathers all of the strangers, the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel, and he puts them to work. They're cutting stones for the house of God, for the temple to be. David provided great quantities of iron for nails and bronze and all of these things. You have a list here of all the material that David gathered. So you have all the preparation for the building of the temple, even if he is not allowed to build it himself. But he gets everything ready so that Solomon can. Now, David has a house full of sons. Even after Absalom murders Amnon, who raped Tamar, his sister, half-sister, Absalom's full sister, and after Joab executes or really murders Absalom during the insurrection against David, even so, David's got a whole house full of sons. And Solomon, Jedediah, is nowhere near the top of the list as far as age and position. He's among the youngest sons. But it's Solomon that David selects to be his successor. So, as he prepares all the material to build the temple, he instructs Solomon, and this chapter 22 has got to be near the end of David's life, because Solomon is a young man when David dies. Here's what you do. All this is ready. You build the house. You build the temple, Solomon. The Lord will be with you so that you can succeed in this. I've provided all of this. Notice in chapter 22, come down here to verse 11, the instruction, the Lord will be with you. Verse 12, may the Lord grant you discretion and understanding so that when he gives you charge over Israel, you may keep the law of your God. Well, he did that for a while. You will prosper if you're careful to observe the statutes and rules that the Lord commanded Moses for Israel. Be strong, be courageous, do not fear, do not be dismayed. Now look at this. With great pains, I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron beyond weighing, for there is so much of it. Timber and stone too have I provided. To these you must add. You have an abundance of workmen, stone cutters, masons, carpenters, all kinds of craftsmen without number, skilled in working gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Arise and work. The Lord be with you. Okay, when you become king, all of this is at your disposal for this specific purpose. Now, 100,000 talents of gold. For reference, a talent in ordinary measure was about 75 pounds. If 1 talent of gold is 75 pounds of gold, this is billions of dollars. I think I said last week, you could make the case that building on this, Solomon may very well have been the world's first and only trillionaire. Because he didn't just add to this, he added to this big time over the course of his rulership and his life. And of course, then all of that wealth was squandered by his descendants and lost in conquests and bribes and so forth. Notice though, verse 17, David commanded all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, is not the Lord your God with you? Has he not given you peace on every side? He has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand. The land is subdued before the Lord and his people. And it's interesting to notice how David says that the Lord is subdued, the land is subdued before the Lord, not before me. The Lord delivered it into my hand. But he gives credit to God in all of this. Now set your mind and heart to seek the Lord. Arise and build, so on and so forth. Chapter 23, you have the record of the organization that David provides for the Levites, for these servants of the temple, what would be the temple. David was old, full of days. He made Solomon his son king over Israel. So Solomon is a young man. David is now 69, 70 years old. He'll die at age 70. He'll reign 40 years, 40 and a half really in total, over Judah and then Israel combined. But in his old age, he's preparing. He's prepared the materials. He's given Solomon the instructions. Now he's going to organize the Levites to take care of this. And of course, this is based on the instructions God had given to Moses in the books of Exodus and Leviticus concerning the Levites. The Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites, the sons of Levi. And you have a record here of who's who. Beginning at verse 7, the sons of Gershon were Ladan and Shimei, the sons of Ladan, Jehiel the chief, Zetham and Joel, 3, and so on and so forth. And then the sons of Kohath, and then the sons of Merari, who were fewer. Eleazar died having no sons, but only daughters, and so forth. But beginning at verse 24 is the listing of their duties and their responsibilities. 20 years old and up to work for the Lord in the house of the Lord. And these are basically the last words of David. These are the final instructions that he gives as king, as he's preparing to meet the end of his life. Notice what he says about this. Their duty, verse 28, was to assist the sons of Aaron for the service of the house of the Lord, having care of the courts and the chambers and the cleansing of all that's holy, any work for the service of the house of God. Their duty was to assist with the showbread, the flour of the grain offering, the wafers of unleavened bread, the baked offering, and so forth, to stand every morning thanking and praising the Lord, likewise at evening, whenever burnt offerings were offered on Sabbaths, new moons, feast days, according to the number required of them, regularly before the Lord. They were to keep charge of the tent of meeting and the sanctuary and attend the sons of Aaron, their brothers, for the service of the house of the Lord. So these are the duties of the Levites in general. And then you come to chapter 24, and here are the priests themselves and the courses of the priests to serve, the divisions of the sons of Aaron. Aaron had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. But Nadab and Abihu died childless. They died before their father did. Of course, you go back to Leviticus chapter 10 for that. They offered strange fire. So all of the descendants of Aaron, the high priestly lineage, come through Eleazar and Ithamar. And with the help of Zadok of the sons of Eleazar and Ahimelech of the sons of Ithamar, David organized them according to the appointed duties of their service. Now notice what it said here in verse 4. Since there were more chief men found among the sons of Eleazar than among the sons of Ithamar, they organized them under 16 heads of fathers' houses of the sons of Eleazar and 8 of the sons of Ithamar. So you've got 24 courses, but you've got twice as many on one side as you do on the other. They divided them by lot, all alike, sacred officers and officers of God among the sons of Eleazar and Ithamar, and so forth. The first lot fell to this one, and the rest of them, all the details are there. Why is this here?
What, the division by lot?
Why are all the details here in the book of Chronicles? This is 500 years, 400 years after the fact that this is being written down.
They have to pick up where it left off, so to speak.
Okay. Judah has come back along with some of Israel from captivity. It's been 70 years for some of them since they had a temple or even the thought of one. It's going to take them 20 plus years to actually build it, because they're going to start and then they're going to stop, and it's just going to sit there, just an unfinished foundation, for 16 years, I think, before they get back to it and get it finished. So you have a time span between the beginning of Babylonian conquest in the days of Daniel, 606 BC, and the beginning of the construction of the temple to its completion down to about 506. You've got roughly 100 years there that there's no temple. And where there's no temple, there's no Ark of the Covenant, there's no altar of sacrifice, there's no table of showbread, there's no lampstand, there's no altar of incense, there's no morning and evening offering. And the people have been expelled from the land for a big part of that time. Now they're back in the land, and the first thing they're supposed to do is rebuild this temple and start things over again, start things going. Well, they need to be sure they do it right. Go back to the record about Uzzah and the moving of the Ark of the Covenant. What was the whole root of the problem? We didn't do it right. We didn't do it like God told us to. So for these people, and think about this, you've got priests among these folks, men like the family of Ezekiel, who had been trained as priests, but they've never had a temple in which to serve. Now they're going to have a temple in which to serve once they get it finished. And they've got to do it right. And they've got to make sure the right people are doing it right. So it's crucially important for them to have the records, the lineage, so that they can do this exactly as they're supposed to. Chapter 25, David organizes the musicians, and you've got the names of all of these, and some of the names that appear here, if you read through this list, you have the sons of Asaph and of Heman and of Jeduthun, who prophesied with lyres and harps and cymbals. And then the sons are named, but those names, Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, those ought to be familiar to us, not from the books of Kings and Chronicles, or even 2 Samuel,
Psalms.
but that's right, from the Psalms, because some of these men are inspired writers themselves in the book of Psalms. How many of the Psalms were penned by the sons of Asaph or by Asaph himself? Several of them. Now, David obviously was the writer of at least half of the Psalms. 75 of them are credited to David. That leaves 75, of which about 30 are what are called orphan Psalms. There's no inspired writer whose name is associated with them. Could be David, could be Asaph. Psalm 90 was written by Moses hundreds of years before David came along. So it could have been Moses. We don't know about those 30 orphaned Psalms. But these men, some of these men, like Heman, like Asaph, like some of their descendants, are men who are also inspired to write praises to God. Well, you have the record of these men here and their descendants, because their descendants are going to serve in this newly built second temple. And you have the record of how David organizes things preserved for them, so that now as they have their opportunity, they can get it right. Chapter 26 gives us the divisions of the gatekeepers, the details of those families, so that that can be done properly. And then you get to the treasurers and the other officials, the folks that take care of the money and the offerings and things like that. And then you come to chapter 27. And in chapter 27, now we're going to turn away from the temple and the priests and so forth, and we're going to talk about the military. The officers and the commanders and the great mighty men and the numbers of soldiers, the divisions. You have in verse 2, Yashobeam, the son of Zabdiel, in charge of the first division in the first month, 24,000, a descendant of Perez, chief of all the commanders. And then Dodai the Ahohite in the second month. And you have these rotating responsibilities here. And then down at verse 16, over the various tribes, the leaders of the tribes. Now, in this, we're going back to the days of David, but this is for the benefit of people living 400 years after David. Why? Because Cyrus's decree in 536 says anybody in the house of Judah that wants to go back to the territory of Judah can go. And not just Judah, but any of the tribes of Israel. So you've got Manassites that go, and you've got Gadites that go, and Benjaminites that go, and Ephraimites that go. Not a lot of them apparently, but some. And just like the Jews, they need to know their lineage, because if nothing else, ultimately there's territory there that will fall to their families. Remember when Joshua divided up the land of promise, it was divided according to the tribes. This tribe gets this piece, and this tribe gets this piece, and this tribe gets this piece, and this tribe gets this piece. But then within the tribes, how was it divided? This clan gets this piece of the tribe's inheritance, and this clan gets this piece, and so on and so forth. And this family within this clan gets this piece, and this family within this clan gets that piece, right on down to the individual families. And those properties were attached to those families and those clans and those tribes, basically in perpetuity. Remember, if they sold their inheritance, what was supposed to happen in the Jubilee year, the 50th year? It's supposed to go back to the original family, so that no name, no family lineage would ever be blotted out of Israel. The worst thing that could happen in their minds was for their name to be blotted out so that there's no more inheritance. In fact, in the days of Moses, before they ever got to this point, what do we have? Come from Moses to Joshua, we have the daughters of Zelophehad, a man who has no sons. And they bring this up. What do we do about this? Well, Joshua has to inquire of the Lord. These daughters inherit, but they have to stay, they have to marry within their own tribe so that their inheritance doesn't go out of the tribe. These people, hundreds of years later, need to know basically their family history, because their identity as citizens of the nation, as part of the kingdom, is tied to that family history. So here, picking up down here at 27 and verse 16, over the tribes of Israel, for the Reubenites, Eleazar, the son of Zikri, was chief officer. For the Simeonites, Shephatiah, the son of Maacah. For Levi, Hashabiah, the son of Kemuel. For Aaron, Zadok. For Judah, Elihu, one of David's brothers. For Issachar, Omri, the son of Michael. For Zebulun, Ishmaiah, the son of Obadiah, and so on and so forth, for all of the tribes. Notice, though, at verse 24, Joab, the son of Zeruiah, began to count but did not finish. Yet wrath came upon Israel for this, and the number was not entered into the Chronicles of King David. Oh, by the way, guess what? Here's a reference to another record, the Chronicles of King David. That's not this, evidently, that these people could read and cross-check. Over the king's treasuries, verse 25, was Asmaveth, the son of Adiel. Over the treasuries in the country, the cities, the villages, the towers, Jonathan, the son of Uzziah, and so forth. All of these details, so that hundreds of years later, these people can look back and say, we know who we are. We know where we came from. We know what should belong to us. And we also know what our responsibilities and our heritage and our obligations should be. So, at chapter 28 now, we come to the end of David's life. David gathers all the officials and gives them a charge, a commandment. And this is the gist of it. You know what I want to do, what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a house for the Lord. He didn't allow it. But here's the promise that he made. I'll establish your kingdom forever if you continue strong in keeping my commandments, just like you are today. And so here's my son Solomon. And Solomon will do this, and you serve him just like you've served me. Come down to verse 11. David gave Solomon his son the plan, the blueprints basically, of the vestibule of the temple, its houses, treasuries, upper rooms, inner chambers, the room for the mercy seat, the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers and treasuries for dedicated gifts, and on and on and on, and all the details of it. Notice verse 19, the summary of it. All this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. Well, what plan? God had given instruction here concerning this temple, just like he had given instruction to Moses concerning the tabernacle in Exodus 25, verse 9, just like he gives instruction to Christians in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5 that we talked about a minute ago. See that you make all things according to the plan. Follow God's plan. Well, then the final charge or the final instruction comes at verse 20. You be strong and courageous. Do this. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. The Lord is with you. And that brings us then to chapter 29, which is the conclusion of David's life and the conclusion of First Chronicles. This brings us then basically to the period of the Kings and Chronicles that we'll be looking at starting next week, beginning with Solomon. chapter 29, offerings for the temple, a record given here. I have provided for the house of my God as far as I was able, verse 2. Gold for the things of gold, silver for the things of silver, bronze and iron, and onyx stones and antimony and all these things. Notice what he says in verse 3. In addition to all that I have provided for the holy house, I have a treasure of my own gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of my God, I give it to the house of my God, 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house and all the work to be done by the craftsmen. And then here's a challenge. Who then will offer willingly, consecrating himself today to the Lord? So David says, here's what I'm going to do. Now, what do y'all do? I'll put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. What do y'all do? Well, they gave for the service of the house of the Lord, verse 7, 5,000 talents and 10,000 darics of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, 100,000 talents of iron. Whoever had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord, and the people rejoiced because they had given willingly. For with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. What was it that the Apostle Paul said, writing to the Corinthians? God loves a cheerful giver. It's interesting that so much of Christendom, so many even in the church, think of 10% as a requirement. And many think 10% is excessive. For the ancient Jew, that was the floor, not the ceiling in their offerings. Brother Roy Lanier Jr., about 30 years ago, did some studying and some calculating about all of the offerings and free will offerings that the ancient Jews gave if they were really focused on trying to be faithful. And by the time he tallied it all up, his observation was that a really dedicated, observant Jew probably gave somewhere between 30 and 50% of their income, gross income, before taxes income, in sacrifices and free will offerings and so forth. And we look at somebody that gives 10% of their income as being extravagantly generous. Well, the balance of this in chapter 29, from verse 10 down to verse 19, is a record of David's prayer in the assembly, in this gathering of his officials. David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly. Blessed are you, O Lord God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours is the greatness and power and glory and victory and majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, and so on and so forth. And as we go through this, the emphasis is on yours, 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 your hand, and we thank you, our God, and so forth. But notice the contrast that comes in at verse 14. Who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to offer thus willingly? All things come from you, and are of your own have we given you. In other words, we're just giving back what belongs to you. This abundance that we provided comes from your hand, and it's all your own. Now he ends up down here at verse 19, grant to Solomon, my son, a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments and testimonies and statutes and do everything. And he starts out well. He doesn't end up well, but he starts out well. And then David calls on the whole group to join him in prayer, to bless the Lord, and they do. Verse 21, they offered sacrifices the next day, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs with drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance. You want to talk about streets awash in blood, they would have been. And it's at this point then that Solomon is anointed to be king, second time, and takes his place on the throne. And shortly thereafter, at the end of chapter 29, thus David, the son of Jesse, reigned over all Israel 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem, and died at a good old age, full of days and riches and honor. And Solomon reigned in his place. Notice the end of this, though. Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, and in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with accounts of all his rule, his might, and the circumstances that came upon him and upon Israel and upon all the kingdoms of the countries. Now, the Chronicles of Samuel the seer may well be the books that we call 1st and 2nd Samuel. But we don't have the Chronicles of Nathan or of Gad. But these are books that those ancient readers evidently could cross-check what's written here by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, next week, we'll move into both 2nd Chronicles and 1st Kings, and that's where the copy of the book, The Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, this little book that I told you about last week by William Crockett, that's where this will be handy, just because it will enable you to kind of keep track of where we are and what we're looking at. And we'll actually begin almost halfway through the book, because we have to get past the reign of David to get to the rest of the Kings and the Chronicles. That's for next week. We'll start with Solomon then. Comments or questions or thoughts before we break? I do apologize. I got last week's class archived and posted just last night. I'm out of the habit. It slipped my mind. I'll try to get this up first thing tomorrow, so that if you want to go back and look at it on YouTube, you'll have the link to it. You did just the you probably got the link for the class itself, but then just this morning, I think, or last night, I sent a link to the archive, to the recording of it, so you can actually go back and if you missed something, you can go back and check it. Questions or comments, folks? Yes, ma'am.
So is the year of Jubilee, has that just been lost in time?
Basically.
So nobody knows when it is. Because we don't know when it started.
Well,
Because it would seem like the Levites would keep the calendar.
I am confident that there are probably Hasidic Jews today who think that they know.
Right.
In the destruction of 70 AD by the Romans, the actual records, both of family lineages and of the historic requirements, the historic records, those were destroyed. There is no Jew today who can point you to actual ancient records and say, this is my family lineage all the way back to Israel, to Jacob.
Only God knows who the real.
They have family histories and family traditions, but they don't have the written records like this that they used to have. And if you think about it, that it makes sense that God would allow that to happen,
because it's spiritual.
because what is the kingdom? The kingdom was never just about the physical nation. That was the type, that was the type that pointed to the antitype, which is the church. That was the shadow that points to the substance, which is the body of Christ. And if all of that was still available, what would people still be doing? They'd still be saying, no, 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 here's my lineage. I can prove it. I can prove it. And you know, you can make the claim, but you can't make the claim good without evidence. And there's no
Y'all did
evidence.
all that on purpose. That's all that
Yes,
is.
ma'am. Just like the destruction of the temple.
That's right. All the
Well, all
same.
right, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
We will see you next time.